I walked out of the hospital conference wing with the weight of a finished decision still pressing against my chest. The meeting had ended cleanly, efficiently, the way these things always did: funding adjustments, legal exposure, risk management. Words that sounded neutral until they landed on real people. My assistant stayed half a step behind me, already speaking quietly into her phone. She leaned closer and reminded me that reporters were lingering near the main entrance, waiting for any image that could be framed the wrong way. I nodded. I knew the routine. Leave quickly. Do not linger. Do not be seen. As we passed the emergency entrance, a white sign mounted to the brick wall caught my eye. No loitering. It was printed in bold letters, clear and unforgiving. Just beneath it, against the cold concrete, sat a woman and a child. The woman looked tired in a way that sleep could not fix. Her coat was thin, pulled tight around her shoulders. The child pressed into her side, small hands tucked under her arms, coughing softly into the open air. Each breath sounded strained. The mother rubbed the child's back in slow circles, as if repetition alone could generate warmth. A security guard stood several feet away, positioned carefully within protocol. He was not cruel. He was not kind. He was doing his job. The waiting area inside was full, he had explained, and hospital policy required them to remain outside until a room opened. I slowed without meaning to. My assistant noticed immediately. She lowered her voice and said we should keep moving. She did not need to explain why. I understood the consequences clearly. If I stopped, someone could take a photo. If I stopped, my presence could be interpreted as a performance. If I stopped, the narrative would no longer belong to me. But if I kept walking, nothing would happen. I would remain clean, untouched, unquestioned. The woman did not look at me. She kept her eyes on her child, jaw set, pride held together by exhaustion. She was not asking for help. She was waiting. The child looked up then, eyes glassy but alert, and met my gaze without fear or expectation. That was the moment my feet stopped. I did not announce myself. I did not speak. I turned and lowered myself onto the bench beside them, leaving a careful distance close enough to share the cold, far enough to respect the boundary she had not voiced. I felt the air shift immediately. Conversations nearby quieted. The guard straightened. My assistant froze, then stepped back, unsure whether to intervene. I stared straight ahead, hands resting on my knees, posture neutral. I did not offer a coat. I did not make a call. I did not explain who I was or why I was there. I simply sat. The seconds stretched. I became acutely aware of how visible I was, how wrong my presence appeared in that space. I could feel eyes measuring the scene, weighing intent, assigning meaning. The sign above us remained fixed, its message unchanged. No loitering. I wondered briefly whether I was violating it, whether authority granted permission or only exposed hypocrisy. The child coughed again, sharper this time, and the mother leaned closer, whispering reassurance I could not hear. She glanced at me, then guarded ready to stand if I said anything that sounded like pity. I said nothing. Inside me, a familiar argument surfaced. This is not your responsibility. You are not qualified. This is not appropriate. It was the same reasoning that had guided so many of my past choices, always logical, always safe. My assistant shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable, her eyes asking without words if I planned to move. I did not. The cold seeped through the bench into my legs, grounding me in a way boardrooms never did. For the first time in years, I was not being watched because of who I was. I was being watched because of where I chose to sit. The child tilted her head, studying me with quiet curiosity as if trying to solve a simple puzzle. Then she spoke, her voice thin, but steady, and asked a question that cut through every justification I had prepared. It was a question that did not accuse, did not demand, and yet made standing up feel impossible. No one told me to move. No one told me to stay. That was the strange part. The security guard did not approach, did not warn me, did not enforce the sign hanging above our heads. He simply adjusted his stance, shifting his weight as if preparing for something he hoped would not be required. A nurse pushed through the emergency doors, eyes already tired, scanning faces with practiced detachment. She saw us, hesitated for half a second, then looked away and continued inside. The mother noticed all of this. I could feel it in the way her shoulders tensed, in the way her hand tightened on her child's sleeve. She was bracing for judgment, for intervention, for a request she did not want to make and would not accept. I stayed still. Silence settled between us, thick and uncomfortable like humidity before a storm. It was not peaceful silence. It was the kind that exposed things. I realized then that nothing I could say would improve this moment. Any words would tilt the balance, introduce power where none had been invited. The child shifted slightly, swinging her feet above the concrete, studying the ground as if it were a map. She hummed softly off-key, unfazed by the tension humming through the air. I became aware of my own breathing, slower than hers, steadier, a luxury I had never thought about before. People passed by, some glancing, some pretending not to see us at all. I could tell who noticed my presence and who noticed only the child. The difference mattered more than I expected. The mother finally looked at me again, eyes sharp, searching for motive. I met her gaze briefly, then looked away, giving her back control of the space. She did not speak. Neither did I. That mutual restraint felt heavier than conversation. In the absence of dialogue, meaning filled the gaps. I felt accused without being accused, questioned without being questioned. The silence itself seemed to ask what kind of man chooses to sit where he does not belong. My assistant stood several steps away. Now, phone lowered, her professional instincts colliding with uncertainty. She had been trained to manage situations, to smooth optics, to anticipate fallout. There was no protocol for this. I sensed her discomfort and understood it. This was a situation with no right posture, no correct angle for a camera. The child began telling her mother about a bird she had seen earlier near the parking lot, describing it in vivid detail. Wings, wide feathers, gray and white. Her voice was clear, unafraid. She did not lower it because I was there. She did not perform for me. That more than anything unsettled me. For years, people had adjusted their tone around me, measured their words, softened or sharpened themselves depending on what they wanted. This child did not. I was background noise to her story. The mother listened, nodding, murmuring agreement, her attention split between comfort and vigilance. She was prepared to leave if asked, prepared to protect her child's dignity at all costs. I wondered how many times she had been forced to move along to justify her presence in spaces not built for waiting. The bench felt suddenly inadequate, an insult disguised as accommodation. I noticed how my presence altered the geometry of the scene. People kept their distance not from the mother and child, but from me. Authority has a way of clearing space without asking. I hated that realization. I wanted to shrink to become unremarkable, but the very effort made me more visible. My mind drifted unbidden to other moments when silence had served me well, when not speaking meant not choosing, when inaction had been framed as neutrality. This silence was different. It demanded something. The mother cleared her throat, a small sound, and adjusted her grip on her child. She did not ask who I was. She did not thank me for sitting. Her restraint was deliberate. She was refusing to give me an opening to step into a role she did not assign. I respected that more than any gratitude. The child stopped humming and looked at me again, head tilted, as if assessing whether I was part of the furniture or something else. Her gaze was steady, curious without fear. I realized then how rarely anyone looked at me without expectation. In that look was no request, no hope of rescue, only presence meeting presence. The cold crept deeper, biting through my coat, a reminder that I could leave whenever I wanted. That choice hovered constant and heavy. If I stood now, I could justify it easily. Meeting to attend, schedule to keep, boundaries to respect. I had used those reasons before, had believed them. But sitting there exposed and silent, I felt the shape of an old decision pressing against me, the memory of walking away from something that had needed time instead of solutions. I did not know yet what I would do next. I only knew that standing up too quickly would confirm something about me I was no longer sure I could accept. The child shifted again, swinging her legs a little higher, and then she looked at me with the kind of directness adults lose somewhere along the way. She did not smile or frown. She simply studied my face as if it were another object in the world worth understanding. Then she asked me a question that felt oddly practical. "Do you have kids?" Her voice was clear, unburdened by hesitation. The mother inhaled sharply and immediately turned toward her, already apologizing before I could respond. "I am sorry," she said, reaching for the child's shoulder. "She talks to everyone." I shook my head slightly and answered before the apology could grow heavier. "No," I said. "I do not." The child nodded, absorbing that information as if it were a weather report. She considered it for a moment, eyes narrowing just a little, and then she said, "That is lonely." The word landed without cruelty. It was an observation, not a judgment. The mother froze mortified, now her hand tightening. "I am so sorry." She repeated, her voice strained, ready to pull the child away. I felt something in my chest shift, a small crack opening where certainty used to sit. "It is okay," I said quietly, though I was not sure who I was reassuring. The child shrugged, apparently satisfied with her conclusion, and turned back to her mother. "Mom says people leave because they are scared, not because they are busy," she added, as if continuing a thought they had been discussing earlier. The mother closed her eyes for a brief second, the kind of reflex that comes from being seen too clearly. She opened them again and looked at me, bracing for offense. I felt exposed in a way no boardroom confrontation had ever managed. The sentence echoed simple and devastating. I had built an entire life around being busy. It had been my shield, my excuse, my explanation for absence. Hearing it reframed as fear unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I did not respond. There was nothing clever to say that would not sound like deflection. The child watched my face closely, waiting, perhaps expecting disagreement. When none came, she seemed to accept the silence as confirmation. The mother cleared her throat and straightened, dignity snapping back into place. She looked at me with a firmness that surprised me. "We are fine," she said, not unkindly but decisively. "You do not have to sit here." I understood what she was doing. She was offering me an exit, protecting both of us from whatever assumptions might follow. I considered taking it. The reasons lined up easily. Respect her boundary, avoid escalation, preserve order. Instead, I stayed seated and simply said, "I know." The child tilted her head again, curiosity renewed. She leaned closer to her mother and whispered something that made her smile despite herself. I caught only part of it. "He looks like he listens." That small comment undid me more than the earlier accusation. Listening had always felt passive to me, secondary to action. Yet here it was reframed as presence, as something visible. The mother exhaled slowly, the tension easing just enough to allow her to sit back down. She did not thank me. She did not invite conversation. She simply accepted the shared space. Around us, the world continued its indifferent motion. Ambulances arrived and departed. Doors opened and closed. Announcements crackled overhead. In the middle of it, that bench became a strange island where truth surfaced without invitation. I realized then how rarely I had been spoken to without calculation. Every interaction in my professional life came with an agenda, a desired outcome. This was different. The child had no interest in what I could do for her. She was curious about who I was when stripped of utility. That question frightened me. The mother adjusted the child's collar, pulling it tighter against the cold, and then surprised me by speaking again. She did not look at me when she did. "We have been here a while," she said, her tone factual. "They told us to wait." I nodded. "How long?" I asked, careful to keep my voice neutral. She glanced at the clock above the entrance. "Almost an hour." Her answer carried no complaint, only endurance. The child began tapping her shoes against the bench, rhythmically humming again, softer this time. I thought about the meeting I had just left, the charts and projections that had felt so urgent minutes earlier. They seemed absurd now, distant and bloodless. The child looked up at me once more, eyes bright despite the cough that interrupted her breath. "If you do not have kids," she said, "then who waits for you?" The question was innocent, almost playful, yet it hollowed me out. I opened my mouth, then closed it. I did not know how to answer honestly without admitting things I had spent years avoiding. The mother sensed the shift and stood abruptly, pulling the child to her feet. "I think we should move," she said, her voice firm but polite. "I do not want any trouble." I rose as well, mirroring her movement, instinctively ready to step aside and let them pass. In that moment, I understood the cliff I was standing on. If I let them leave now, I could tell myself I had done enough by not walking away at first. I could file this under a moment of reflection and move on unchanged. The child looked up at me as she stood, her expression serious now. She seemed to sense the decision forming. I realized that whatever I did next would answer her question more clearly than any words ever could. The mother did not move away immediately after standing. She paused as if weighing something, then turned slightly toward me, her posture straight, her expression composed in a way that told me she had practiced this before. "I want to be clear," she said. "We do not need help. We are not asking for anything." There was no bitterness in her voice, only resolve. I nodded once slowly, letting her set the terms. "I understand," I replied. "I am not here to offer anything." That seemed to surprise her. She studied my face again, searching for the familiar signs she had learned to distrust: the tilt of pity, the hint of superiority, the expectation of gratitude. Finding none, she exhaled. "Good," she said. "Then we are fine." The child tightened her grip on her mother's hand, but did not pull her away. Instead, she leaned closer, as if anchoring herself. I realized then how deliberate this moment was. The mother was not testing my generosity. She was testing my respect. I stayed quiet, letting the space breathe. After a moment, she gestured toward the bench. "We will sit until they call us," she said, reclaiming the place without asking permission. I sat back down only after she did careful to mirror her pace to avoid reclaiming authority through movement. The cold had deepened, creeping into my bones, but I welcomed it. Discomfort felt appropriate. The child kicked her feet again, then stopped and looked at me with renewed curiosity. "What is your name?" she asked. The mother shot her a warning glance. "You do not have to answer that," she said quickly. "It is okay," I replied. I gave my first name, only nothing else, no titles attached. The child repeated it softly, testing the sound, then nodded as if filing it away. The mother did not ask for my last name. She did not ask what I did. That restraint felt like a gift. Minutes passed in relative calm. I could sense my assistant hovering at the edge of the scene, torn between intervening and respecting what was unfolding. I did not look at her. I did not need to. The mother glanced at the entrance, then back at me. "We have had people sit before," she said quietly, as if offering context rather than accusation. "Usually, it turns into something else. Questions, advice, offers that come with strings. I do not want that." I met her gaze and held it. "Neither do I," I said. That answer seemed to settle something between us. The child coughed again, harder this time, and the mother instinctively wrapped her arms around her, murmuring reassurances. I stayed still, resisting the urge to intervene, to suggest, to fix. This was not my space to manage. The sign above us loomed large in my peripheral vision, its message unwavering. No loitering. I wondered how often rules like that were enforced selectively, how often they pressed harder on those with fewer options. The mother noticed my glance and followed it. "They point to that sign a lot," she said. "As if sitting is a crime." Her tone was dry, resigned. I felt a flicker of anger, then sharp and unfamiliar, directed not at any one person, but at the structure that made this moment ordinary. I swallowed it. Anger without action would only burden her. Time stretched again, the waiting itself becoming a test of endurance. Finally, the mother shifted and stood once more this time, with a decision clearly made. "They might not call us soon," she said. "I do not want her getting sicker out here." She gestured to the child. "We will try another entrance." Her voice held no plea, only determination. I stood with her, stepping back to give them space. I did not offer to walk with them. I did not ask where they were going. I simply said I hope they see you soon. The sincerity surprised me. The child looked up at me again, her face thoughtful. She studied me as if comparing this version to the one she had first encountered. Then she smiled, small and brief, and said my name again. The mother hesitated, then spoke almost reluctantly. "Thank you for not making this harder," she said. It was not gratitude. It was acknowledgement. They took a step away, then another. I remained where I was, watching them go, feeling the familiar urge to retreat alongside them, to leave this exposed place. Instead, I stayed rooted to the bench, aware that standing too quickly would undo what little trust had been established. As they moved toward the side entrance, the child glanced back and called out, her voice carrying in the cold air. "Are you coming back?" The question caught me off guard. The mother stopped, clearly annoyed now, and turned to hush her. I did not answer immediately. I did not want to promise something I could not keep. I settled for honesty. "I do not know," I said. The child considered that, then nodded, accepting uncertainty with more grace than most adults I knew. "Okay," she said. "We will see." They disappeared around the corner, leaving the bench empty beside me. The absence felt louder than their presence had been. My assistant approached, then, her face a mixture of concern and disbelief. "We really should go," she said softly. I nodded, standing at last, my joints stiff from the cold. As we walked away, I realized something unsettling. For the first time, I did not want distance. I did not want the safety of disappearance. I wanted to know whether sitting there had meant anything beyond the moment itself. And that desire, quiet and persistent, followed me long after the hospital doors closed behind us. I returned the next morning for a legitimate reason that required my signature and nothing more. The hospital corridor smelled of disinfectant and old coffee, and the day felt colder than the night before. I did not head for the emergency entrance at once. I waited near the wall and told myself that if they were not there, I would accept it and leave. When I saw the mother and the child again, my first instinct was to stay where I was. I did not wave or approach. I waited for them to notice me and decide. The mother saw me first. Her eyes narrowed not in anger, but in assessment. She did not smile. She did not stand. She simply held my gaze for a long second, then looked away. The child followed her line of sight and broke into a grin. "He stays," she said to her mother, as if reporting the weather. The mother did not correct her. She shifted slightly on the bench and, after a pause, nodded once. That was permission enough. I sat down at the same distance as before and placed my hands where they could be seen. I did not ask how the night had gone. I did not ask what they needed. I breathed and waited. Minutes passed. People came and went. A nurse brought a clipboard and called names that were not theirs. The child drew shapes on the fogged glass with her finger and laughed when they vanished. The mother watched her with the focused calm of someone conserving energy. I noticed the way the wind cut through the entrance and how the child shivered despite the brave face. I wanted to offer my coat and did not. I wanted to call someone and did not. Presence without power felt like restraint, and restraint felt like respect. The mother finally spoke. "We were told to wait out here because the triage rooms were full and because her symptoms were not urgent enough," she said. Her tone was factual. I nodded. "That should not mean cold," I replied before I could stop myself. She looked at me sharply, then softened. "It should not," she agreed. She did not ask what I planned to do. She did not ask who I knew. She trusted me only to stay within the boundaries she had drawn. The child tugged my sleeve gently and asked if I would still be there when they were called. I said yes, and meant it in the smallest way possible, meaning only this bench and this hour. The security guard glanced over and did nothing. The sign above us remained unchanged. No loitering. The absurdity of it pressed on me. I realized that power often announces itself loudly while presence asks permission quietly. The mother stood to adjust the child's scarf and then surprised me by asking a question of her own. "Why are you really here?" she asked. I considered the answer carefully. "Because yesterday I walked away from things that needed time," I said. She accepted that without comment. The child leaned against my arm and I did not pull away. When a nurse finally called their name, the mother rose quickly. Gratitude and fear crossing her face at once, she hesitated and then looked back at me. "Thank you for waiting," she said. It was the first time she had used those words. I stood and watched them go inside, and I did not follow. I remained on the bench until the door closed, and then some minutes longer because leaving immediately felt like a lie. I stayed because returning to motion too fast would have turned the bench into a gesture instead of a decision. I watched the automatic doors breathe open and shut and thought about how easily systems define urgency without ever feeling consequence. The cold deepened, and with it my awareness of time passing unused. I thought about power as a tool I had learned to wield from a distance, and how distance had become my default solution. Sitting there, I understood that waiting is labor when you have nowhere else to go, and that choosing to wait when you do have options is a kind of accountability. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I ignored it. I imagined the mother inside answering questions while guarding her pride, and the child pretending not to be scared. I promised myself nothing beyond this moment because promises can become another form of pressure. When my assistant returned and asked if we should leave, I said soon and meant later. I let the cold teach me patience. I let the bench teach me proportion. When I finally stood, my legs trembled and I welcomed that reminder. I did not feel heroic. I felt properly small. As I walked away, the sign remained behind me, and for the first time I wondered who it was really written for. I kept walking slowly, letting the lesson settle without rushing to name it. The hospital noise faded and the street noise returned, carrying the ordinary rhythm of people who were warm and moving. I did not call anyone. I did not plan a fix. I held the absence like a weight that belonged to me. Tomorrow I would return for work and meetings and decisions, but tonight I would carry the memory of that bench. It would not make me better by itself, but it would make forgetting harder. I accepted that change begins with staying long enough to be uncomfortable and ends when comfort stops being the goal. That realization followed me home and refused to be quiet. It asked for consistency, not drama, and patience, not credit. I did not know yet how to answer, but I knew the answer would require time and the courage to remain present. I took a breath and accepted that staying would cost me more than leaving ever had. That felt like the right beginning for me there. The next time I saw them, it was later in the afternoon when the light thinned and the air felt sharper. I arrived earlier than necessary and chose the same bench without ceremony. I did not text anyone. I did not alert staff. I sat and waited as if waiting were a skill I needed to relearn. When they appeared, the mother looked more tired than before, yet steadier as well. The child moved slower and leaned into her side. They noticed me, and this time there was no hesitation. The mother nodded and the child lifted her chin in recognition, as if we were continuing a conversation paused mid-sentence. We settled into the same arrangement. Silence returned, and with it the familiar unease. The child traced shapes on her sleeve, then looked up at me with a seriousness that made me sit straighter. She asked a question quietly, careful not to draw attention. "If someone could help, but does not," she said, "is that leaving too?" The words were simple and arranged without accusation, yet they struck me harder than any boardroom challenge. I felt my mouth open and close. I searched for language that could defend me without lying and found none. The mother stiffened immediately, ready to intervene, to apologize, to redirect, to protect. I raised a hand slightly to stop her. "It is okay," I said, and meant that the question deserved an answer even if I could not give one. The child waited patient and focused. I realized then how much I had relied on speed and certainty to avoid exactly this moment. I remembered past choices framed as prudence and caution and timing. I remembered people who had needed more than a meeting and received less than a phone call. I remembered how often I had told myself that not choosing was not harm. The bench felt colder beneath me, as if the question had pulled heat away. I took a breath and said, "I do not know." The honesty surprised us all. The child nodded as if that were acceptable data. The mother watched me closely, her skepticism softened by the absence of performance. I continued because stopping felt like another escape. "I think sometimes people choose safety and call it something else," I said. The child considered that, then asked if safety keeps you warm. The question landed with quiet precision. I shook my head. "Not always," I said. The mother looked away briefly as if something private had been touched. A nurse stepped outside and called names that were not theirs, then returned inside. The moment stretched and I felt my defenses thin. I realized that the child was not asking me to fix anything. She was asking me to name a truth she already sensed. I felt something give way inside a place I had fortified for years. I had told myself that my distance was responsibility, that my restraint was maturity. Sitting there, I saw it differently. Distance had been my refuge. Restraint had been my avoidance. The child leaned against her mother and closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again and looked at me with gentle insistence. "If you can help," she said, "will you stay?" The mother turned sharply alarmed now, ready to pull her away to protect both of them from disappointment. I felt the weight of the words stay settle on my chest. I did not promise. I did not reach. I said yes in the smallest honest way, meaning I will stay right now. The mother exhaled slowly, then looked at me and for the first time asked a question of her own. "Why does this matter to you?" I did not answer immediately. I thought about power and influence and how easily they can be mistaken for help. I thought about how little of myself I had allowed into the spaces where people waited. It matters because I have left before I said, and because leaving felt easier than learning how to stay. She absorbed that and did not challenge it. The child coughed again, and the sound drew the attention of the security guard, who stepped closer, then stopped when the mother lifted her hand. The guard nodded and stepped back, respecting the boundary without being asked. That small courtesy felt monumental. The mother squeezed the child's hand and spoke softly. "We will be called soon," she said, as if reassurance could be summoned by repetition. The child nodded and looked back at me. "If they call me," she said. "Will you be here when I come back?" The phrasing caught me. "Not if I go inside, but when I come back." I felt a tightening behind my eyes. "Yes," I said without qualifiers. I meant it now, with the clarity that comes after something breaks. When the nurse finally opened the door and called their name, the mother stood quickly and guided the child forward. She paused and looked at me. "Do not make this into something," she said, not unkindly. "I will not," I replied. They disappeared inside and I remained alone on the bench. The absence felt heavier than before, but it did not scare me. I stayed seated through the chill and the stares and the slow passing of time. I stayed because leaving now would have been an answer to a question I could no longer accept. I stayed until my phone vibrated again and I silenced it. I stayed until the doors opened and the nurse returned with an update meant only for them. I stayed until my legs ached and the cold settled deep. In that waiting, I felt something unfamiliar. Accountability without spectacle. Presence without reward. I understood then that being able to help and choosing not to is a form of leaving, even if your body remains. The question had broken me open, and I welcomed the break because it let something honest through. I did not know what staying would require next. I only knew that whatever came after would need to be chosen again and again without witnesses. That knowledge felt like a burden and a beginning. I sat with it and did not look away. I did not expect the break to come the way it did. It arrived not with shouting or accusation, but with recognition. The mother returned first, her shoulders tight, her eyes sharper than before. The child followed slower still, pale but calmer, holding a folded sticker sheet like a prize. They saw me at the same moment. The child smiled faintly and lifted the stickers as if to show proof of bravery. The mother did not smile. She stopped short and studied me in a way that felt different from caution. It felt like calculation. I stood up instinctively, then stopped myself and sat back down, understanding that sudden movement now would read as retreat. She approached and spoke quietly so only I could hear. "They told me your name," she said. The word "told" carried weight. I asked who she meant, though I already knew. "A nurse," she said, "someone who recognized you from a panel last year." The world narrowed. I felt the ground tilt slightly. I said nothing. The child sensed the shift and looked between us confused. The mother took a breath and straightened. "So this was not an accident," she continued. "This was not just a man sitting because he felt like it. This was a man who can change things, choosing not to say so." I tried to answer and failed. Every sentence sounded like strategy, even the true ones. She continued before I could recover. "I have seen this before," she said. "People with power who stay close enough to feel good about themselves and far enough to leave clean." I felt the accusation land and understood why it hurt. Because it contained a version of me I could not deny. The child tugged at her sleeve and asked what was wrong. The mother softened immediately and knelt to meet her eyes. "Nothing," she said gently. "We are going home." The child looked at me uncertain, then back at her mother. "Are we not waiting anymore?" she asked. The mother shook her head. "Not here." She stood and turned to me again. "I do not want help," she said. "I do not want proximity. I do not want a lesson for your next speech." Her voice remained even, but the distance was absolute. "I told you my boundaries, and you crossed them by not being honest." I wanted to say that honesty had felt like another form of intrusion, that naming myself would have shifted the balance and taken something fragile away. Instead, I said, "You are right." The simplicity startled us both. She paused, then nodded once as if confirming a decision already made. "We are done," she said. She guided the child past me and toward the exit. The child looked back, once eyes searching, then looked forward again. I stayed seated because following would have been another violation. I watched them leave and felt the bench empty beside me like a judgment. The collapse came after in waves. I felt foolish for believing presence could exist without identity. I felt exposed for thinking restraint could substitute for truth. I felt the old instinct rise to fix, to explain, to arrange a safer narrative. I resisted it. I went home and did nothing. I did not call anyone. I did not send messages through intermediaries. I sat in my kitchen with the lights off and the city humming beyond the glass. I replayed the conversation and saw where my silence had turned into deception. I understood that trust is not built by withholding power, but by refusing to use it while also refusing to hide it. The next day, I did not return to the hospital. I did not want my presence to become pressure. I told myself that staying away was the only ethical choice left. That night, I slept poorly and woke with the sense of something unfinished pressing on my chest. The following afternoon, I learned through a quiet channel that the child had been admitted overnight. The information arrived without request and without invitation. I did not act on it. I sat with the knowledge and let it hurt. That restraint was new and it was not clean. I wanted to be there and believed I should not. The conflict felt like punishment and instruction at once. On the third day, I walked past the hospital without stopping. I did not look toward the bench. I kept my eyes forward and felt smaller for it. Later, I learned that the mother had asked staff not to share information with me. The clarity of that boundary was devastating and deserved. I accepted it fully. That evening, I wrote a short note and did not send it. It said only, "I am sorry," and nothing else. I understood that apologies without access can still be real. The midpoint was not a reconciliation. It was a severing. The trust I had begun to earn was gone, and it was my fault. I saw that my presence had been meaningful precisely because it had not asked for anything, and now even that meaning had been compromised by my silence. I faced the possibility that the story would end here, and that staying would mean learning how to let go. That realization stripped away the last comfort. I had always believed that good intentions could survive misunderstanding. Sitting alone, I accepted that they cannot. Only accountability can. I resolved then to change what I could without their knowledge or permission, and to do so without expecting return. If staying was to mean anything, it would have to exist without them seeing it and without me being seen. That decision felt like a loss and a relief. I did not know if it would matter. I only knew that I could not go back to who I had been before the bench. The collapse had done its work. I was alone again, but not unchanged. The question now was whether change could exist without proximity, and whether staying could be quiet enough to honor the boundary I had broken. I did not yet know the answer. I only knew that whatever came next would have to be chosen without them watching and without me being forgiven. I stayed away because that was what respect required, but staying away did not mean leaving. It meant choosing a different kind of presence that did not need permission or gratitude. I began with listening to the system instead of the people tracing the edges where waiting became punishment and rules became shields for indifference. I asked questions that sounded procedural and small, the kind that rarely trigger alarms. Why were families told to wait outside during overflow? Why benches were metal instead of insulated? Why updates were given to some and delayed for others? I did not attach names or stories. I did not argue from emotion. I framed everything as risk mitigation and patient flow. Changes came slowly and without ceremony. A portable heater appeared near the entrance with signage about safety. Folding chairs replaced the bench on colder days. A volunteer schedule adjusted to include evening coverage. None of it pointed back to me. None of it needed to. I learned to be satisfied with invisibility. Days passed and I did not return to the entrance. I did not look for them. I let the boundary stand and felt the ache of it sharpen into something steadier. Then one afternoon, I walked by at a distance and saw the heater in use. A small victory warmed me more than recognition ever had. I heard later that a child had commented on the warmth and that a mother had thanked a volunteer without knowing why the change existed. That was enough. I began to understand that quiet staying is measured by effects, not appearances. I did not control outcomes, I only removed obstacles. I noticed how often the system asked people to prove patience, and how rarely it offered dignity in return. I worked there in the margins where approvals happen without headlines. I refused to rush. I refused to brand. The work became a discipline. On a night when the city froze and traffic slowed to a crawl, I learned through an internal update that a pediatric case had escalated. I did not know the name. I did not need to. The update listed age symptoms and arrival time. I recognized the pattern and felt my chest tighten. I stayed where I was. I made calls that authorized staffing and cleared space without reference to myself. I did not go to the hospital. I waited at my desk until dawn and watched the system respond the way it should have all along. In the morning, I received confirmation that the child had stabilized. Relief arrived quietly and stayed. I understood then that staying can look like absence and still be faithful. Later that week, I learned something else through a staff comment relayed casually. A child had asked why the chairs were warm now and whether they would be there tomorrow. A volunteer had answered yes with confidence. That answer mattered more than my presence ever could. The mother I had wronged did not know what I had done, and I did not need her to. Repair does not always travel the same road as trust. Sometimes it takes a longer route that passes through humility first. I kept my distance and continued the work. I refused invitations that would have placed me in photographs. I delegated praise to others. I began to feel lighter. The habit of staying quietly reshaped how I moved everywhere else. I listened longer in meetings. I stopped interrupting. I allowed pauses to exist. People filled them with truth. The work taught me patience without audience. Then the call came late one night, not to me directly, but to the system I had been tending. A child was coming in fast with breathing trouble and the entrance protocols engaged. The chairs were ready, the heater was on. A nurse stayed outside to update the caregiver. I imagined the scene without inserting myself. I trusted what I had built to hold. Hours later, I learned that the child had been admitted and that the caregiver had been calm. Calm is not an accident. It is a product of being seen by a system that does not push you out when you are already at the edge. I slept for the first time in days. In the morning, I walked past the hospital and did not stop. I felt no urge to test the boundary. Staying had moved somewhere else inside me. I realized that power becomes dangerous when it insists on proximity and honest when it accepts distance. The quiet work continued. A month passed. Winter eased slightly. The heater was stored and the chairs remained. Volunteers kept their shifts. The change held. I felt something settle into place. Then a message arrived through the same indirect channel that had delivered other updates. The child had been admitted again overnight. The note was brief and procedural. I read it twice. The old impulse rose to go there and sit. I let it pass. I authorized resources and stayed put. I understood that choosing not to appear was now the choice that honored the boundary. Quiet staying had become real staying. It did not ask to be witnessed. It did not ask to be forgiven. It simply held the line. I did not know if I would ever be allowed back into their lives. I accepted that outcome. The work did not depend on it. What mattered was that when the night grew hard, the system did not grow cold. That was the promise I kept. I learned that repair can happen without reconciliation and that dignity does not require a face to thank. In that understanding, I found a steadier version of myself. The collapse had cleared space for this discipline, and I was grateful for it. I stayed quietly and meant it. The night chose me before I chose it. The alert came after sunset, the kind that bypasses routine channels because time has narrowed to minutes. Pediatric respiratory distress escalating arrival, imminent resources requested. I read it once and then again, letting the words settle without panic. I had learned not to rush toward visibility, but this night was different. Presence would not be symbolic here. It would be practical. I authorized the steps that cleared space and mobilized staff. Then I drove not to the entrance where cameras and rules would pull me into the story, but to the side lot where night staff parked and no one asked questions. Inside, the air carried that familiar mixture of antiseptic and winter coats damp with melted snow. I stayed near the wall and watched the system move. It moved better now. The chairs were in place. A nurse stood where she could be seen. Updates came in short, steady intervals. I did not announce myself. I did not claim authority. I took a seat where anyone could sit and waited. The mother arrived holding herself together the way people do when they have practiced being brave. The child was wheeled past and the doors closed. I stayed seated. Hours stretched. The waiting room thinned until only a few shapes remained hunched in plastic chairs, eyes fixed on nothing. I stayed seated. When a volunteer brought water, I accepted and passed it along. When a phone rang nearby, I did not look. I let the night do what it needed to do. I could have left after the authorizations were complete. That would have satisfied the old version of me. Instead, I stayed because leaving would have been easier, and this night was about choosing the harder fidelity. At some point, the mother sat across from me without recognition. She did not need to know who I was. She needed the room to hold. The nurse came out once, then again, each time with measured words that built a bridge from fear to information. I watched the mother breathe with the cadence of those updates. I felt the urge to speak and let it pass. Presence does not require commentary. It requires endurance. Midnight slipped by. The floor cleaner hummed in the distance. I counted breaths without counting minutes. When the doors finally opened, the doctor stepped out with the look that says stabilized but not finished. Relief did not explode. It landed. The mother nodded and pressed her hands together. I remained seated. When the doctor explained the plan, I listened and memorized it not as leverage but as respect. The mother glanced at me, then a brief recognition that I had been there the whole time. She did not smile. She did not ask. That was right. Later, she stood to stretch, and I stood too, matching her pace without approaching. The child would be admitted. The night would continue. I knew then that the choice was not about being seen. It was about not leaving when nothing was required of me. I stayed until dawn softened the edges of the room. I stayed through shift change and paperwork and the quiet hum of machines that do not care who you are. I stayed until staying felt ordinary. That is how choices become character. In the morning, I left the same way I arrived without ceremony. Outside, the cold had eased. Inside, the work continued. I did not follow up with calls. I did not seek reassurance. I trusted what I had chosen. That trust was new. It felt like standing without armor. I returned to my day and carried the night with me, not as a story to tell, but as a line I would not cross again. When updates came later, they were stable. When days passed, the system held. The night had asked a simple question, and I had answered it by staying. I understood then that choice is not a moment, but a posture. It does not announce itself. It repeats quietly until it becomes who you are. I chose to be there without being needed, and that choice mattered. It mattered because it was costly and unrecorded, and therefore true. Belonging did not arrive with a name. It came without paperwork or permission, without a chair pulled closer or a hand offered. It settled in slowly the way a room warms after the heater turns on, and no one notices the exact moment the cold leaves. The child stabilized over the next days, then weeks, the kind of recovery that does not move in straight lines but trends forward if you keep faith with the process. I did not insert myself into updates. I read what was appropriate and let the rest be. The mother learned the rhythms of the unit, the timing of rounds, the unspoken rules of when to ask and when to wait. I matched her pace without aligning myself beside her. When we were in the same space, we were simply two adults occupying chairs that belonged to no one. I learned how easy it is to confuse help with ownership and how necessary it is to avoid that mistake. I did not fix anything. I stayed. That was the work. Mornings came with paper cups of coffee and the sound of carts rolling down hallways. Afternoons brought sunlight through narrow windows that cut the room into bright rectangles. Nights returned with their questions. I remained present without crossing the line into becoming necessary. That distinction mattered. It allowed trust to grow without obligation. One evening, the mother spoke first, not to thank me, but to clarify a boundary. She said she did not want favors, did not want exceptions, did not want to owe anyone. I told her she owed nothing and meant it. We agreed on a simple rule. We would be honest about what we could and could not do. That rule held. The child noticed before either of us did. Children are precise observers of patterns. He said I was there the way the clock was there. Not helpful, just constant. I accepted the description. It was accurate. Over time, the room changed. Not because of me, but because time changes rooms. The machines quieted. The charts thinned. The mother slept in fragments that lengthened. I learned the names of nurses without using them. I learned how to sit without performing patience. I learned that belonging is not a role you claim. It is a permission you are given, and it can be withdrawn if you move too fast. I moved slowly. When discharge plans began to take shape, I stayed within the frame. I did not offer rides or resources unless asked. When asked, I answered plainly and routed help through systems rather than hands. The mother noticed. She said staying was harder than saving. I agreed. Saving ends. Staying continues. On the day the child walked the hallway without assistance, the mother did not look for me. She did not need to. That was the point. Later, she found me by accident near the elevators. She said one sentence that did not ask for anything. You did not fix us. You stayed. The words did not land as praise. They landed as recognition. I understood then that belonging without title means you are not the center of the circle. You are a part of the ground it stands on. When the hospital board invited me to speak about patient experience, I hesitated. Speaking can turn presence into performance. I agreed only on the condition that the story would remain anonymous and specific, not inspirational, accurate. I prepared by writing less than I thought I would say. The mother was not mentioned, the child was not described, the chairs were, the signs were, the hours were. The board listened in a way boards rarely do when the subject cannot be monetized. Afterward, there were nods and notes and a request for follow-up. I declined applause and accepted accountability. Belonging does not require witnesses. It requires continuity. When the child went home, I did not accompany them. I watched the doors close from a distance and felt the room exhale. The belonging did not leave with them. It had already rearranged me. I returned to my work with a different metric, not outcomes but endurance, not credit but cost. I stayed available without hovering. Weeks later, I saw them in the lobby by coincidence. The child waved, the mother nodded. No introductions were made, no explanations offered. We shared the small recognition that comes when people have carried the same night. That was enough. I walked away without regret. Belonging without title means you can leave without breaking anything. It means what was built does not depend on you. That is the quiet proof that presence worked. I learned that night, and the weeks that followed had not given me a place in their family. They had given me a place in myself. That place did not need a name. When the invitation arrived, it did not feel like an honor. It felt like a test. The hospital board wanted me to speak not as a benefactor or executive, but as a witness to a process they were struggling to define. Patient experience had become a phrase that lived comfortably in reports while remaining elusive in practice. They wanted clarity. I wanted restraint. I agreed on one condition: no names, no images, no appeals to emotion. If I was going to speak, it would be without hiding behind generosity or authority. It would be an accounting. The room was familiar in the way all boardrooms are familiar. Long table-muted light water pitchers that never seem to empty. People settled into their seats with the posture of decision-makers, pens, ready screens glowing. I stood without notes in my hands because notes can become shields. I began by describing the sign outside the emergency entrance. No loitering. I described it plainly, the font, the placement, the logic behind it. Then I described 2 chairs positioned just beyond the reach of warmth. I spoke about time passing without intervention and how silence operates as policy when no one challenges it. I did not frame myself as brave. I framed myself as late. I told them I sat because standing would have been easier. I said that presence is not the absence of action, it is the refusal to leave before understanding the cost of leaving. I watched the room change as I spoke, not dramatically, subtly. People leaned back instead of forward. Pens paused, screens dimmed. I talked about boundaries and why crossing them feels generous but corrodes trust. I explained how systems can help without centering the helper and how that distinction protects dignity. I said the hardest work I did was not fixing anything but resisting the urge to. The board asked questions that were careful and managerial. How do we replicate this? How do we scale it? I answered by saying you cannot replicate presence with a program and you should be suspicious of any attempt to do so. You can only remove obstacles that prevent people from choosing it. I spoke about chairs and warmth and rules that assume bad faith. I spoke about how people behave better when they are not being evaluated. When the questions ended, there was a silence that felt earned. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of recalibration. I did not wait for approval. I thanked them for listening and sat down. After the meeting, there were emails and requests and an appetite for language that could carry what had been said into policy. I helped where it made sense and declined where it did not. Speaking without hiding meant allowing discomfort to remain. It meant not resolving everything with a plan. In the weeks that followed, small changes appeared. Not press releases, adjustments. Chairs moved closer to warmth. Signs revised to include exceptions written in human language. Training sessions that replaced scripts with principles. None of it bore my name. That was intentional. Credit would have turned the work into a story about me instead of a correction the system needed. I learned that accountability spoken aloud has weight only if it continues after the room empties. I kept returning to the hospital for reasons unrelated to them. I took meetings. I listened to reports. I asked about wait times and signage and how discretion was taught. I noticed the absence of the two people who had anchored my nights and accepted it. Their lives were moving forward. That was the point. One afternoon, I saw the child again from across a corridor. Healthier, taller. He looked at me with recognition that did not demand anything. The mother met my eyes and nodded once. We did not stop. That mattered. It meant our connection was not maintained by proximity, but by what had already been done. Speaking without hiding had not created a bond. It had honored one and then stepped out of its way. I thought often about how easy it would have been to tell the story differently, to center my decision, to describe the night as transformative. That version would have been tidy and wrong. The truth was slower and less flattering. I did not change because I sat once. I changed because I kept sitting after the moment passed. I spoke without hiding because hiding would have turned presence into performance. When the year turned, the hospital released an internal review that mentioned a shift in approach to waiting spaces and patient discretion. I read it without pride. Pride would have missed the lesson. The lesson was that systems do not need heroes. They need adults willing to remain visible when rules are insufficient. Speaking without hiding is not about confession. It is about refusing the comfort of distance. It is about staying close to the consequences of what you say. I carried that forward into other rooms and other decisions. I asked where the chairs were. I asked who waited outside. I asked what silence was doing on our behalf. And when I spoke plainly. No names, no drama, just the facts of what happens when someone chooses to stay. A year passed without ceremony. Time did what it always does when no one tries to dramatize it. It moved forward quietly, carrying small corrections instead of grand reversals. The hospital entrance looked the same at a distance, but closer, it felt different. Chairs were arranged with intention, not as an afterthought. The sign remained, but beneath it was language that allowed judgment instead of forbidding it. People still waited, but they were no longer erased while doing so. I noticed these things the way you notice weather patterns after a long winter. Not with relief exactly, but with recognition. The child returned to school full-time that fall. I learned this not because anyone told me, but because the mother mentioned it in passing when we crossed paths in a corridor and paused long enough to exchange a few words. She looked steadier. Not grateful, not triumphant, just steadier. The kind of steadiness that comes from sleeping through the night without listening for alarms in a child's breathing. We did not sit together anymore. We did not need to. Belonging had shifted from proximity to continuity. I saw them occasionally after that never planned, always brief. At a pharmacy, in the parking structure. Once at a community meeting where she spoke about access without once referencing me or that night. I listened from the back and understood that this was what success looked like. Being unnecessary. My life did not change in visible ways that others could point to. I still worked long hours. I still moved through rooms where power spoke fluently, but something in me had lost its appetite for distance. I noticed who waited. I noticed who left first. I noticed how often decisions were made in the name of efficiency that only redistributed inconvenience to those with the least leverage. I began asking quieter questions. Who is outside right now? What rule is doing work we have not examined? Where is the chair? People sometimes laughed thinking I was being metaphorical. I was not. Chairs are policy when no one else is watching. The hospital sent an end-of-year note thanking staff for patience during procedural changes. It named no catalyst. That was correct. The work had not started with a meeting. It had started with a choice to remain visible when leaving would have gone unnoticed. I did not attend the holiday gathering they hosted in the lobby. I did not need to. That space belonged to families who now lingered without apology. I passed through one evening and saw the child at a table with a book, his feet swinging above the floor, his mother filling out a form without tension in her shoulders. He looked up and smiled. It was not a smile that asked for anything. It was a smile that recognized continuity. That was enough. I left without saying goodbye. Belonging does not require ritual. It requires reliability. The year also changed me in ways that were harder to articulate. I stopped measuring my worth by outcomes I could announce. I started measuring it by what remained after I stepped away. Did the chairs stay? Did the language hold? Did the people who needed space have it without needing to ask? These questions did not make me popular. They made me useful. I learned that restraint is a form of care, that not naming yourself as the reason something improved protects the improvement from becoming dependent on you. The mother sent a card once. No address on the return, just a sentence written carefully. We are doing well. Thank you for letting that be enough. I kept it in a drawer and did not respond. A response would have shifted the balance. She did not need affirmation. She needed room. As winter returned, I thought about warmth differently. Not as something delivered, but as something maintained. The child grew an inch. The mother took on new responsibilities at work. The hospital adjusted intake procedures again. None of it traced back to me in a way that could be diagrammed. That was the point. Belonging had been earned by staying until staying was no longer required. On the anniversary of that night, I walked past the entrance and paused where I had once sat. The chairs were occupied by different people now. I did not sit. I nodded to the security guard and kept walking. The system was holding. That is how you know when something has been done right, when your absence does not undo it. I understood then that family is not always defined by shared space or names or permanence. Sometimes it is defined by the moment you choose to stop moving and the discipline to leave once movement is no longer abandonment. The child never called me father. He called me something else once months later when we passed each other near the exit. He said you stayed, not as a title, as a fact. I nodded and kept walking. That was the only name I needed. No one was saved by money. Nothing was repaired by announcement. We were steadied by presence and released by trust. That is what remained when the story ended. Before you leave this story, I want to ask you to stay for just a moment longer, not because there is something more to explain, but because stories like this do not really end when the screen fades. They linger in the quiet spaces where we recognize ourselves. Maybe you have been the person sitting outside waiting longer than feels fair, holding yourself together while the world moves past. Maybe you have been the one who had the option to keep walking, telling yourself it was not your place, not your responsibility, not the right time. Most of us have been both at different moments, and that is why stories about presence matter more than stories about rescue. This was never about a powerful man doing something extraordinary. It was about an ordinary decision made without applause, without certainty, without knowing how it would turn out. Sitting down instead of walking away is not heroic. It is uncomfortable. It is awkward. It exposes you to being misunderstood. and yet it is often the only thing that changes the shape of a moment. If this story stayed with you, it may be because it reminded you of a time when someone did that for you, or a time when you wished someone had. The truth is that most pain does not ask to be fixed. It asks to be witnessed without conditions. In a world that measures value by speed, efficiency, and results, staying feels almost rebellious. Waiting with someone who cannot offer you anything back feels irrational. But dignity grows in those irrational spaces. That is where trust forms. That is where people stop feeling invisible. As you listened, you might have noticed how little money mattered in the end, how no grand gesture solved everything, how what endured was consistency and restraint. That is not an accident. Healing that lasts is usually quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not need witnesses. It simply holds. And maybe that is why this kind of story resonates most with those who have lived long enough to know that life rarely changes all at once. It changes through small decisions repeated when no one is watching. If you are here still listening, you are part of that understanding. You are someone who values depth over spectacle, meaning over noise. This channel exists for people like you, people who believe that kindness does not have to shout, that strength can look like patience, that love sometimes means staying silent and staying put. When you choose to subscribe, you are not just supporting a channel. You are choosing to keep space open for stories that honor ordinary courage, quiet resilience, and the kind of humanity that rarely trends but always matters. You are helping ensure that these stories continue to be told slowly, carefully, without rushing past the moments that deserve our attention. If this story reminded you to pause, to look again, to sit when walking away would be easier, then it has already done its work. Carry that with you. Share it if you know someone who needs a reminder that they are not alone in their waiting. And if you stay with us for the next story, know that you are welcome here, not as a viewer to be counted, but as a presence that matters. Because in the end, what changes lives is not power, not money, not perfect timing. It is the simple, difficult choice to stay.